Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 8, Social and Political Problems from Questions and Answers, Fundamentals of the Occult Sciences by Manly P. Hall. Social and Political Problems, Part 8. What form of government, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, or communism is the best? It is not the form of government, but the integrity of the governing power that is of the greatest significance. Any form of government will succeed if it is administered justly and unselfishly. No form of government will succeed when the governing power exploits its citizenship or sacrifices the common good to its own selfish purposes or policies. According to Plato, there are three forms of government in the world, only three forms possible to man. Each of these, justly administered, will bring prosperity and peace to both the governing power and the body of the governed. Each also, if abused, will bring misery and ultimate destruction. The first form, according to Plato, is monarchy, the rulership by one. This, by perversion, becomes tyranny. The second form of government is aristocracy, rulership by a certain part of the people. This, by perversion, becomes oligarchy or class oppression. The third form of government is the commonwealth, or government by all of the people. And this, by perversion, becomes a chaos in which the unfit, by their majority in number, reduce the state to impotency and ultimate oblivion. What we commonly call socialism or communism is an aspect of the commonwealth described by Plato. It is rulership by all, but for its success it demands the intelligence and integrity of all. A commonwealth or democracy or socialist government can succeed only when each citizen elevates the common good above his own advantage, thinking first of his neighbor and his country and of himself only after the common issues have been solved. Philosophy teaches that because of the imperfect state of man and because of the evident and inevitable inequality throughout nature, it is not possible for all men to rule, nor is it desirable that the state shall rest its security in the keeping of the great mass of comparatively immature and unlearned people. Philosophy therefore teaches that at this stage of human evolution, the best form of government is that in which the wisest people of any state or country rule or lead. Those less informed should cooperate by giving their allegiance and obeying the laws which have been established by those of greater wisdom and vision. Plato called this system government by the philosophic elect. It will yet be demonstrated in society that this is the only system whereby all men may participate together in the wisdom and safety of enlightened leadership. There are only a few great, wise, and good men in the world at any one time. Under our present systems of government, these men are seldom called to high stations of leadership, the governments of the world being dominated by cliques of professional politicians. When the wisest lead, then the most rapid progress is assured. When the uninformed lead, civilization loses purpose and perspective. And when those of ulterior motive lead, men live in fear and uncertainty, victimized by the ambitions of unscrupulous tyrants and despots. A people capable of self-government require little government and few laws. Many laws demoralize the state and bring with them the psychology of civility and oppression. Let the laws be few and good. Let the people respect their leaders, and the leaders earn the respect of their people. Nations will flourish, peace will abound, and the prosperity of empires will be assured. What is the proper philosophical attitude towards war? All great systems of religion and philosophy agree that war is the greatest collective misfortune with which humanity is afflicted. Yet wars have constantly plagued humankind since the days of the Atlantean conquerors and have come to be regarded as essential elements of progress. Most of the nations of the modern world have had their origins in war, have sustained their separate policies by the power of arms, and are threatened with annihilation if they relax their armaments. The general lack of understanding between races and nations and the selfish, aggressive attitudes of so many of the world powers have resulted in a general world acceptance of the inevitability of war. With the virtues of heroism sung to the youth of every nation, and war condoned as a necessary evil, the way of the peace lover is hard. Under the name of patriotism, young men are invited to perpetuate racial antagonisms and national feuds. The civilizing influences of education and culture have subdued and transmuted much of the barbarism of primitive humanity. But war has resisted all mellowing and refining influences, and with each passing generation, scientific destructiveness assumes more frightful and devastating proportions. In this day, peace is on the lips of all, but hate is in the hearts of so many that it appears that much more suffering must come to the world before mankind can turn from hating to the arts of peace. It is difficult to set a fixed standard to be followed by each man in his attitude towards war. After all, standards of right and wrong are individual problems, based on the highest conviction of the individual. Certain classes of mankind believe in war, prefer combat to peaceful living, and measure superiority in terms of combativeness. Only ages of experience and suffering can mature such types to the degree that they will understand and appreciate gentler standards of living. Then there is another type of humanity that accepts war as a personal responsibility and from patriotic motives is willing to go forth and die for the generals or the dictators or the munition manufacturers. This level of mankind may be naturally peace-loving, home-loving and non-combative in its personal relationships, but under the spell of patriotic fervor may elevate war to the plane of a divine necessity and march forth to death, martyr to gods of conflict. There is a third class of people who, thoroughly disgusted and disillusioned as to both the causes and effects of war, feel that it is virtuous and right to protect home and country from the aggressions of other militant powers. This is the entirely defensive attitude, and by most progressive thinkers, is accepted as the highest standard possible under existing world conditions. Then there is the last group, composed of avowed pacifists who refuse to participate in any form of military conflict, regardless of motives, causes, or circumstances. This last group is steadily increasing in society and will in time exert a powerful influence in the affairs of nations. The peace-loving citizen of any so-called civilized nation is concerned with one almost insurmountable obstacle to his pacifistic desires. That is, the system of compulsory militarism which forces him into war whether he will or not. Of course, if he refuses to fight in the face of this law, he may be imprisoned or in extreme cases even executed. It is very hard to be sane in a crazy world, and minorities, even though they be right, are nearly always the victims of majorities, especially in so-called democratic nations. The metaphysical philosopher, faced with the problem of war, has one of two courses open to him. The first is to openly avow his pacificism and bear cheerfully and resignedly the abuses which will be heaped upon him, or he may volunteer for some line of service in which his duties are of a constructive rather than a destructive nature. If he cannot prevent war, he may be able to contribute some peace or security to those afflicted by war. The medical corps, hospitalization work, and other lines concerned with the reclamation of destroyed and demoralized health or courage offer constructive work and a field of very great and real service. The philosopher cannot approve of war, but he cannot always prevent war. He must realize that his greatest field of work is educational. In times of peace, he can teach the follies of war. In times of war, he can teach the blessings of peace. His own actions in the emergency of war will be considerably influenced by the circumstances and conditions of the hour, but under all conditions he must strive to the fullest possible degree to promote the well-being and enlightenment of all with whom he comes in contact. Should an idealist enter politics? It is a sad day for government when such a question concerns public mind. Theoretically speaking, the idealist belongs in politics. There is no science that needs progressive idealism more desperately than the science of statesmanship. Yet, to succeed in the science of government, an idealist must possess practical experience. Otherwise, he may ruin not his own life alone, but the whole life of empire. Unfortunately, when we think of an idealist, we generally think of an individual hopelessly lacking practical and provident virtues. He possesses the qualities of the poet and the inventor, and suffers the general condemnation that is heaped upon both these abstractionists because of their lack of realism. In modern politics, what is generally meant by an idealist is an honest man, a truthful, upright person shipwrecked in a sea of intrigues and perversity. Honesty used to be regarded as a homely human virtue, but now in politics it is defined as an abstract, impractical menace to the present methods of accomplishing results. In recent years, honesty has been evaluated to the vanishing point, and in political leadership is regarded as a potential detriment to advancement and success. Idealists are, for the most part, non-combative persons ill-framed by nature for stratagems and spoils. For this reason, they find it exceedingly difficult to cope with dishonesty. For not having enough of it in themselves, they do not know how to recognize it in others. Therefore, honesty becomes their undoing, and in the end, they are nicely framed by their political associates and made to appear the most dishonest reprobates of all. It has well been said, if you have a good reputation and wish to keep it, stay out of politics. It is easy to see, therefore, why politicians draw to themselves others of like and equally shady character. It is also easy to see why politics go from bad to worse, until communities are bowed to despair under the corruption of their governors. Yet this very disease of corrupted leadership shows how desperately a remedy is needed. If a man has courage of conviction, an unshakable integrity, and has dreams for a better state of man, with sufficient practical experience to build adequate foundations under his dreams, his place is in politics. But he must be prepared to fight for his life and reputation. He must be prepared to sacrifice his wealth, his peace of mind, and possibly his good name in the desperate struggle against overwhelming odds. He must attempt all this with the realization that he has only a fighting chance of success and no probabilities of either recognition or reward. He must also fully realize that the constituency for which he is sacrificing so much will neither appreciate nor support him, and that in time of trouble he can only turn inward for strength and encouragement. He must realize that he has not made an easy or glamorous choice, but is opposing with his single strength the selfish stupidity and corruption of one of the most powerful organizations in the world, the body politic. Political science had its origin in the complex of social problems arising in national and racial civilization. Laws are rules of contact and relationship, founded upon necessity and intended to sustain individual and collective integrity. As the majority of human beings are neither wholly wise nor wholly honest, grievous evils have arisen. Ambitious men have perverted the interpretations of law to their own profit, and having achieved positions of power and authority, have made other laws for their own advantage at the expense of the public good. There is scarcely a time to be found in history when the political systems of so-called civilized nations were not corrupt. Yet in the face of this general perversion, it still remains evident that laws are necessary, that government is necessary. The individual must be protected against the schemes of his neighbors and the corruptions within himself. Although most politicians are insincere, political science itself is useful and necessary at this stage in human development. It is natural, therefore, that wise men should desire to correct the evident defects in political systems, that mankind may enjoy the protection of honest and efficient codes and statutes. I cannot see how it is possible for a philosopher to ignore the evident need for political reform. At the same time, it is painfully apparent that the wise, being utterly in the minority, can accomplish little by attacking and decrying existing evils. Nearly all of the great world teachers realized that the majority of mankind were not sufficiently evolved to solve their vital problems with philosophy alone. The majority benefited most through the correction of the social and economic ills which oppressed them. Buddha bitterly attacked the political theocracy of India, striking at the very soul of political privilege when he attacked the caste system. Socrates paid with his life for his bitter denunciation of the Athenian policy of privileges and the delinquency of legislators. Confucius devoted his life to the reformation of the philosophies and political institutions of China. Zarathustra first converted the king to his doctrine that he might begin his reformations with state. Moses and Aaron defied the Pharaoh of Egypt, and Judaism arose on a foundation of social reforms fully equal in significance to the religious purposes. 6 of the 7 sophists of Greece were legislators and political reformists, as were also Pythagoras and Plato. It is generally acknowledged that Jesus was a reformer of Jewish social and political law, and Muhammad fearlessly attacked the whole legislative theory of Arabia, denouncing the privileges of the Meccans, and established a doctrine that not only dominates Arabia, but encroaches upon every social and political aspect of Islamic life. It is the duty of the philosopher to labor unselfishly and devotedly for the promulgation of truth, wisdom, and justice. he must perforce withdraw his support from any individual or institution which functions inconsistently with reasonable standards of integrity. On the other hand, political corruptions, like ignorance of which they are a part, cannot actually be remedied by legislation but must be finally corrected by the improvement of human nature itself. Therefore, the philosopher may say, I cannot make a man honest, but if I can dispel ignorance, he will become honest himself. Philosophy always approaches the political problem from an educational viewpoint. If we can make enough people see the reality of those great laws of life which circumscribe all mundane affairs, they will live better as individuals. The integrity of the individual is the cornerstone of social and political well-being. How can we live a spiritual life in a materialistic world? The secret of spiritual security is detachment. In a sense, every age is materialistic, yet in each of the civilizations of humanity and in each of the periods of history, great saints, sages, and saviors have risen out of the racial level and taken their places among the immortals. It is not the world we live in that counts, it is the way we live in the world that is important. The world presses in upon us to the degree that we respond to the emotion of attachment. While accumulation dominates the purpose for living, all men are oppressed by their environment and limited by their times. Yet in philosophical matters, material possession does not ensure superiority. Great thinkers seldom arise from the moneyed classes. The rich are too burdened by their possessions. They have neither time nor energy left with which to contemplate the philosophic truths of life. While the poor long for wealth and the rich long for peace, and those of moderate condition long for everything, the spiritual equation is accorded little consideration. Most religious people attempt to combine a search for spiritual improvement with a frenzied effort to build up the economic standing. Such a division of energies results in a general chaos. When the question is asked, how can I live a spiritual life in a materialistic age? The questioner frequently means, how can I be enlightened and enriched at the same time? There have been some convenient little metaphysical organizations spring up to assure a certain type of humanity that the universe is particularly interested in the financial standing of aspiring souls, and that illumination ensures an ever-flowing fountain of wealth, happiness, and personal magnetism. The profound thinker, however, is not deceived by such pretenses. The sage knows that he cannot serve God and mammon at the same time. Therefore, he withdraws from the psychology of economics and sets about the task of perfecting his own life through the mastery of appetites and desires. Moderation is the beginning of wisdom. Those satisfied with nothing are the salt of the earth. Philosophy does not teach improvidence or the neglect of responsibilities, but it would temper those inordinate ambitions which inevitably lead to ruin, developing more and more of inward consciousness. The aspirant to spiritual things lives less and less in the material world, demands little from it, and is not deceived by its appearances. A man can live spiritually in this generation if he will make spirituality the purpose of his living, and will sacrifice to that purpose the less worthy aims. Materiality is necessary to spiritual accomplishment. The physical world is the antechamber to the temple of the mysteries. Those who cannot pass the tests of living cannot expect to enter the house of the mysteries. Would you advise a man to leave civilization who cannot make spiritual progress among a corrupt and evil populace? It is not possible for anyone to run away from life. There is an old Arabian fable of a man who sought to escape from the evils of existence only to discover that the shadow of them pursued him to the most distant parts of the earth. At last he learned that this shadow was his own body, and that the one evil that no man can escape is himself. Philosophy does not advise truth seekers to run away from experience, but rather to use wisdom to face experience more intelligently. These stirring and difficult times in which we live are important to the soul growth of each individual. Philosophy is not merely a studying of books or a thinking of beautiful thoughts. Philosophy is living well in a world which tests the capacity of the individual to live well. Life itself is an initiation into the sanctuary of the divine mystery. As neophytes of old were tested as to courage, integrity, and wisdom by various trials devised by the priests, so modern truth seekers are tested by the adversity of life. An individual who cannot achieve where he is cannot achieve anywhere else. Achievement is an inner strength rising up secure and sufficient. Strength comes from action and adversity. The years ahead will be trying years. The steel of the human soul is tempered by the flame of suffering. To what degree is a university education useful to a person interested in the perfecting of his inner spiritual life? The answer to this question must be understood to be an entirely individual matter. To some, higher educational opportunity is of the greatest importance, whereas to others it is comparatively meaningless. Education does not ensure spiritual superiority, that is, the type of education to be secured from our colleges. On the other hand, education can bestow capacity and appreciation, and all other things being equal may be an aid to the appreciation of metaphysical values. The ancients regarded education as a prerequisite to philosophy. Pythagoras would accept no disciples who had not achieved scholastic honors, and Plato caused a panel to be placed over the gate of his school, on which were the words, "Let no man ignorant of geometry enter here." The value of so-called higher education depends upon the motive which moves the student to learning, and also the mental capacity of the student himself. Of course, youth is without the experience necessary for the higher appreciation of educational opportunity, and very few college students are moved to their studies by any great spiritual aspiration. It is only years afterwards, when most of the schooling has been forgotten, that the mature person begins to wish that he had been more attentive in his periods of learning. One of the greatest students of comparative religion and philosophy in the modern world was deprived by poverty of the benefits of a university education. General Albert Pike, soldier, scholar, philosopher, and Freemason, was turned from the house of learning because he could not pay the matriculation fee. Thus denied, he educated himself and became one of the greatest scholars of the modern world. In his advancing years, the university which had refused him admission offered General Pike an honorary degree. Pike declined, saying that when he had needed the university, it had refused him, and that he now had no use for its honors. After his 60th year, Pike mastered the Hebrew language, also the Persian tongue, and Sanskrit, and translated the sacred scriptures of the Jews, Persians, and Hindus, with numerous important commentaries. Education is necessary to philosophy, but education is not always to be secured from those institutions presumably dedicated to its promulgation. The shallowness of our present educational theory means usually dubious returns for the years spent in the modern college. How can we solve religious differences in the home? Religious differences in the home are much more apt to be theoretical than truly spiritual. Religion may be defined as veneration for God, the love of beauty, and the doing of good works. Such a code cannot conflict with any enlightened system of religion, and therefore so-called religious differences are illusionary rather than real. Bigoted people clinging to the jot and tittle of some narrow creed are naturally and inevitably intolerant because of the smallness of their viewpoint. Such individuals are very difficult to get along with if you attempt to argue them out of their notions or impose a new religious concept upon their thinking. But even these people usually mean well. They often sacrifice and suffer in a sincere effort to live up to or down to the dogmas they have accepted. Sincerity is virtue that must not be despised, even if certain forms of it are distinctly annoying. The metaphysician, however, has his own peculiar faults and is seldom faultless in his interpretation of religious ethics. So-called progressive thinkers are frequently an intolerant group, despising the opinions of conservatives and making themselves generally obnoxious among people whose opinions differ from their own. If the metaphysician resents efforts to impose the orthodox upon his mind, he must remember that orthodox people are equally disinclined to accept beliefs which they regard as heretical and dangerous. Philosophy teaches that a man's religious life is strictly a personal matter. No one has a right to dictate the religious beliefs of another. But true metaphysics is an interpretation rather than a cult, and if properly used, does not conflict with or discredit any system of religious thought. The purpose of philosophy is to bring not arguments, but fuller understanding, deeper appreciation, and a fuller and more perfect tolerance. If you are studying metaphysics and your belief is opposed by the members of your family or causes dissension and unpleasantness in your daily life through the interference of others, remember this: metaphysics is an inner experience. No one needs to know that you're a metaphysician. Let others observe only that you live more nobly and more honestly, that you're more gentle and kindly, that a new wisdom has come to you, that you no longer worry, fret and argue, that you live a happy, normal and contented life. If your metaphysical interests are evidenced by these improvements in yourself, there is little likelihood that your beliefs will be very heartily opposed. It is when we talk incessantly of noble things and live unpleasant and obnoxious lives that people become irritated with our words because our deeds are so different. To harp continuously on mystical platitudes and fail in the daily problems of life discredits the individual and casts a reflection upon the doctrine which he claims to believe. Live ignobly and no one is interested in your religion. Live nobly and beautifully and all men will desire the secret of your living. Let your life and not your lips bear witness to your doctrines, then you can mingle with all faiths and beliefs of men and live side by side with those of different opinions. All men admire improvement, but they are tired of platitudes which bring no change in conduct. Do not try to convert people, just convert yourself, and things are liable to turn out well in the end. Should religion be taught in the public schools? Religion should most certainly be taught in the public schools, but religion, not theology. Religion, in the proper sense of the word, is spiritual ethics, and its foundation is the teaching of the broad principles of right and wrong, absolutely indispensable to constructive and successful living. Theology, on the other hand, divided as it is into innumerable sects and isms, cannot be taught in the public schools of any democratic or liberal thinking country. In ancient times, religious education was part of the national life in highly civilized countries. The religion of the country was the state religion. Where state religion existed, morality and ethics were the very foundation of education, and standards of integrity were comparatively higher among educated people than they are under our present system of divorcing religious influence from the state. Our highly diversified background complicates the religious problem in the United States. Parents of over 250 sects and creeds send their children to public schools and must be assured that nothing will be taught to these children which will conflict with the creedal religious training that they receive or should receive in their homes. Baptist parents do not want their children to be taught Methodist doctrines. The Presbyterians will have no Mormonism inculcated upon their children, and the Orthodox Jewish families will court no Roman Catholicism influencing the formative minds of their offspring. This has been a stalemate in religious education, with the result that the young hopefuls graduate from the public school entirely devoid of ethics and are ready to swell the ranks of first offenders in those thousands of petty misdemeanors which are the first steps to careers of crime and perversion. The trouble has been first that the religious education which the school is not permitted to give is also in the majority of cases neglected in the home or presented in such narrow sectarian terms that the children themselves revolt against the bigotry of the older generation and so have no religious ethics to direct their codes of living. Also, it is a mistake to believe that religious education needs to interfere with the theological limitations of any personal perspective. No matter how narrow and intolerant a person is in religious matters, he will generally uphold the 10 Commandments and the Golden Rule. There is sufficient religious material common to all the sects of Christendom, Judaism, and other religious groups to permit of sound religious education that conflicts with nothing and can accomplish only good. All religions worthy of the name of religion acknowledge the existence of a supreme principle of good which controls the universe with law and order and decrees that men shall live together honestly, justly, and benevolently. All religions commonly concur in the teaching that a virtuous life is acceptable and necessary, and that justice and honesty in relationships and dealings promote the spiritual state and preserve human society. A beautiful religious outline could be formed acceptable to all and be the common denominator of the religious life of the country. Children could be given this liberal education, and the result would be a marked decrease in juvenile delinquency and human unhappiness. Of course, the teaching of comparative religion in the higher grades of the educational system would be a most important step forward in the civilizing of humanity. But this cannot come yet. Much intolerance and bigotry must be done away with first. The partial remedy here suggested must be the first step. The spiritual ideals of the race must find some common denominator from which to work. A simple but vital truth such as the golden rule could be that common denominator. In time, comparative religion will probably have precedence over many of the so-called practical sciences in the field of education. No individual who does not understand the several great religions of the world has any right to regard himself as educated. For in spite of all the industrial and mechanical emphasis of the last few generations, religion and religious thought are still the greatest moving forces in humanity, the greatest living power of the world. To study the Greeks and not their religions is foolishness. To study India, China, Egypt and Rome without mastering with their history, their ethics and aesthetics is to leave out of education the very soul and essence of it. Involved problems of comparative religion belong, of course, in the higher grades of education. But the beginnings of interreligious understanding should be included with the ABCs and the 3 Rs. Is marriage a physical or spiritual union? And what about divorce? In common with all the other sacraments of ancient religious institutions, the ceremony of marriage is a symbolic ritual. It rests with the two who are joined together. Whether or not spiritual values play a part in marital relationship, whether the bond of marriage is solemnized by the clergy or merely legalized by a justice of the peace, can have little bearing upon the integrity or permanence of vows or obligations. The spiritual life of man is not in the keeping of either the church or the state. Each human being is his own high priest, and only obligations he makes to himself are real. Marriage is blessed only by the sincerity and devotion of those two who mingle their lives in a common destiny. Marriage is no more permanent and no more sacred than the standards and ideals of the man and wife. Lawgivers of the ancient world established the laws of marriage to promote monogamy and established responsibility for the protection and education of children. The home was designed as a perfect institution, the unit of measurement for nation and empire. But a home is not a home simply because of the laws of the nation or the religious opinions of the day. If the home fails within itself, it is worst form of stupidity to force uncongenial people to remain under the same roof for the sake of the dignity of conventions. Under our present social psychology, mismating is the general order of things. Successful marriages are the exception. The factors which contribute to the permanence of the home are disappearing from our daily life. Under such conditions, it is frequently impossible to preserve a home or to reorganize one that has been broken by divergent opinions. Two people starting from a certain point may develop unequally, so that their interests diverge through the years until in the end, nothing remains in common. This cannot be prevented, and life together under such conditions is frequently unbearable. For two people to live together under such conditions is more dangerous to the spiritual life than an amicable and intelligent termination of the whole affair. In the matter of divorce, children are usually the greatest sufferers, but under some conditions, divorce is even better for the child. A child may be better off without any father than with a drunken or abusive one, and separate maintenance is often the lesser of two evils. This does not mean that homes should be broken over trivial and inconsequential differences, or that a home is necessarily impossible for individuals of different mind and opinion. If, however, the sympathies die out, if respect and affection have been hopelessly broken, a separation is the only reasonable and sensible procedure. It has been observed that the successful home is to a considerable degree the result of education. The percentage of divorces among graduates of universities which teach eugenics is much smaller than among graduates of schools omitting this important subject. Young people woefully uninformed on the responsibilities of marriage contribute heavily to the income of divorce attorneys. Divorce, like every other institution devised to remedy evils in society, is frequently abused. It is far less disgraceful, however, to come forward openly and acknowledge that it is necessary to remedy a mistake than it is to suffer through the years in a silent, pathetic way of the orthodox-ridden centuries which have preceded us. The ceremony of marriage, if simple and sincerely performed, may serve as an inspiration and guide through the years to come. It is wise to remind young people of the dignity and solemnity of the step they are taking. The good thoughts of well-wishers may be a source of power, and beauty of the occasion satisfies the aesthetic impulse, giving the union the advantage of culture and refinement. But as surely as a funeral service cannot ensure the future of the dead, so surely a marriage ceremony cannot ensure the harmony of the living. It is not a God in the heavens, but the God in the heart which sanctifies the institutions of men. From an occult standpoint, the association of lives is a necessary step in the evolution of humanity. Each person, being in himself androgynous, possesses a male-female nature, one objective and the other subjective according to the sex. Thus, in the male, the female nature is latent but not absent, and in the female, the male nature is latent but likewise subjectively present. Through association, the objective nature of each is complemented by the objective nature of the other, the result being an androgynous unit composed of half of the male and half of the female. Everyone has observed how persons long married take on each other's mannerisms and to some degree even appearances. Through marriage, each of the parties is gradually building up the latent part of themselves, as decreed by the law of nature. Man unfolds aesthetic powers, developing his intuition and imagination. Woman is unfolding intellectual powers, strengthening her reason and individuality. The doctrine of soulmates is not accepted in the great schools of philosophy. The sexes are equal and complete in their spiritual parts. Each soul is perfecting itself from association with the other, but it should not be believed that the two will ever merge into one. Rather, each is becoming in itself a perfect whole, and by so doing is united in the end with the universal one, which is the cause and ultimate of existence. To what extent are parents responsible for the lives of their children? Of all the animal kingdom, man is the most helpless in his infancy. For many long years, his survival depends upon the assistance of those about him. A child's well-being is the special responsibility of its parents. It is their duty to preserve its life through infancy and shield it from the adversities of life until it becomes capable of controlling its own destiny. Parents must view this responsibility as a debt they owe to nature. Each human being pays the debt for his own birth and upbringing by sacrificing in his own turn for those whom he brings into the world. The process of birth, with its attendant growth and development, is the only way in which human beings can come into this world. But it is a mistake for parents to assume possessive attitudes towards their children. Nor are children indebted to parents beyond a reasonable degree of appreciation. Parents do not own their children. Rather, it is their duty to assist and direct the unfolding life until this life is capable of directing its own destiny. A certain veneration is natural to man, and it is proper that the child should appreciate the struggles and suffering parents pass through to give it opportunities in life. Parental responsibility ends when the child reaches majority. It is then a free agent to live as it pleases, and interference with its life beyond that point usually does more harm than good. If a child has been brought up wisely and honestly until majority, its character is usually set in paths of integrity. Children who disappoint their parents later in life have usually been disappointed in their parents earlier in life. Very often, our own mistakes live in our children. A father or mother who constantly reminds a grown son or daughter of their eternal indebtedness to parents is guilty of a serious mistake which frequently ends in tragedy. Parents who earn the respect of their children are usually respected and honored, but nagging, overshadowing parents must look forward to lonely years. It is the duty of the parent to sow the seeds of integrity in the child's life, to train the child wisely and gently, and then to release it and send it forth into the world to live its own life. According to philosophy, incarnating souls are drawn into families in order to receive types of experience which they have earned in previous lives. Very often, spiritually, the child is older than the parent, and it is, of course, entirely erroneous to view the newborn infant as newly formed by the hand of God. Children are usually attracted to parents whose level of consciousness is similar to their own, or who offer the opportunities for the payment of a certain specific type of karma. This is the reason for the saying, like father, like son. This is also the reason why parents so frequently find their own worst faults perpetuated in their progeny. This is not due to heredity, but to the principle that like attracts like, and souls needing certain types of experience are drawn to homes where this experience is to be found. Parents who abuse, neglect, or mistreat their children may look forward to the same kind of treatment themselves in future lives. Parents who cling to their children, warping their destinies and denying them freedom of experience, will suffer from the same factors when they come into the world again. A skeptic on the subject of reincarnation once asked, why so many tragedies occur to small children, themselves incapable of reasoning out the responsibility for their own actions? The suffering which children pass through is usually the result of actions in a previous life as parents who abused their children. A parent who neglects his child may be born a neglected child. Nagging parents will be born in homes of nagging parents, for whatever we do, that in turn shall be done unto us. Therefore, the parent who seriously and conscientiously fulfills his duties and responsibilities not only does that which is right according to the law of life, but makes easy his own way in lives to come. The code of morals that guided the older generation is breaking down. What will be the new standard of personal conduct? For nearly 2,000 years, Western civilization has been dominated by the moral force of Christian theology. The essential doctrines of Christianity were founded in the Mosaic law, the principal modification being the recognition of the aesthetic or cultural factor. Christian theology was devised by a special class in society and imposed upon the rest so that it did not represent an honest social trend. In its beginning, the Christian code was extremely simple and particularly evident in its lack of originality and inspiration. It was developed with an almost ferocious literalism. Everything subtle or controversial or individual was eliminated from it, and the code of conduct assumed the proportions of an infallible revelation. The element of growth has always been lacking in the Christian theology, and this shortening of perspective produced first inhibition and then rebellion. Modern society is emerging from the dark ages of theological inhibition. The standards of morality are shifting from formulae to fact. The old church first arbitrarily defined the universe and its laws, and then set itself to the task of bending all human spirits to this preconceived pattern. Modern society realizes that a considerable part of the so-called Christian code of conduct is the product of a type of mind incapable of seeing life honestly and incapable of courageously facing the larger inferences of personal action and personal freedom. We have only to study the lives of the early theologians to realize that they would be incapable of formulating a broad, deep, and understanding philosophy of conduct. Theology is actually based upon a theory of introversion, limitation, and repression. The "thou shalt not" idea puts everything into the negative, so that from the first the mind is turned from normalcy to stilted, circumscribed, and narrowed interpretations. Philosophy differs from religion particularly in its acceptance of the integrity of life. Theology, overwhelmed with the magnitude of evil, devotes too much of its time to the problem of original and secondary sin to perceive the sincere and profound values of life. Philosophy, having no doctrine of original sin and acknowledging no principle of evil in the world, sees the mistakes of man as sharing a common divinity with his good deeds. Mistakes are inevitable in the process of growing, but the philosopher sees something divine even in the errors of the race, while the theologian sees something infernal even in its virtues. The focus of culture is moving gradually towards the East. Psychology is intrinsic to Eastern culture, whereas in the West it is assumed as something outside and apart, to be mastered only with the greatest of effort. The Western mind has not learned to think naturally in terms of fact. It has been long confused by artificial and superficial standards. The shift from a Western to an Eastern basis means a change from a collective to an individual or personal code of ethics. The Eastern philosopher thinks of life as flowing from himself, whereas the Westerner thinks of life as an ocean in which he is immersed. The Eastern classics find space, creation, and all the laws of being within the self. And the Western thinker sees himself as an infinitesimal speck in the midst of an immeasurable existence. The Easterner, therefore, has more courage than the Westerner. In fact, to the Westerner, The Oriental has a sublime audacity which gives him the right to live above the law, or with himself as the law, instead of merely one who bends eternally to the whims of God of the state. The Chinese philosophy of conduct is possibly a rounded statement of what the West is groping for. China moved from a theological to a philosophical foundation in prehistoric times, experiencing in almost forgotten ages what we are struggling through today. Taoism is the mature product of mature thinking. It is without illusion, but it did not fall into a crassness as the Western extremist has a tendency to do. The beginning of the Taoist code of life is his realization of what life is and the ability to accept it on a moderate level of significance. The Taoist refuses to be overwhelmed by life. He refuses to be drowned in a sea of circumstance or to drown himself in the torrent of his own outpourings. To him, creation, life, and experience are so terribly real and so profoundly deep that there is nothing he can do about them except realize them. Without any effort to mold them, change them, modify them, or resist them, the Taoist viewpoint would be very unsafe if he did not have a profound realization of his fundamental premise. For inaction can arise either from the grossest ignorance or the deepest wisdom. When the Westerner faces life, he immediately wonders what he can do about it, but the Easterner, realizing that no one can do anything about it, develops the qualities of an exquisite acceptance and accomplishes a very strange, but, when understood, deeply significant tranquility towards both inward and outward matters. The untrained person cannot easily appreciate the integrity of the Chinese sage, but flourishing under his own philosophy, the celestial enjoys 150 to 250 years of life without the friction of resisting inevitables or the corruption of complaint, strivings, yearnings, or petulance. It is not a life of inertia, but a life of action based upon an adequate viewpoint, and therefore restricted in nothing, limited in nothing, and with no temptation to excess in anything. A difficult viewpoint to attain, but astonishingly subtle when attained. The first principle of the Taoist code is an acceptance of fact. Fact in its most brutal and uncolored form. Fact becomes the foundation of philosophy, and nothing is believed or admitted to the belief that is inconsistent with fact. Fact is made the ideal. It is neither realism nor idealism as we know it, for the real becomes the ideal becomes the real, and the fundamental confusion which besets the West is cured at its very beginning. Applied to Western living and thinking, philosophy advances the premise that the confusion of living is largely the result of building up inadequate foundations, or foundations colored and distorted by specialized interpretation. Nothing is as noble as the truth, nothing is as adequate as the truth, and nothing more difficult to discover. Yet, in the end, no elaborate structure of belief can be more permanent than the creed of truth itself. Not theologically speaking, but ethically and culturally speaking, the fact must be the beginning. The fact is that life as truth and as law is flowing forever through an infinitude of modes and forms. Life itself is the fact in these modes and forms. It has its own laws and cannot be measured by any of the manifestations through which it passes. The life in man is his truth. If he ceases to exercise his own mental power of limitation, the life itself moves him, and these motions are true to the degree that he does not interfere with them. He cannot, however, accomplish life without a complete impersonalization of his viewpoint. Every mood and emotion that dominates him, even temporarily, causes him to impose his own purpose upon life. Having distorted life to his own ends, he then examines his own distortion and calls it life. Upon this distortion, he builds a system of laws of measurement and control. But he never realizes that life itself requires no control, because its every motion is intrinsic and innate reality. It may stem that we are wandering about in extreme abstraction, but particulars are all suspended from abstraction. According to the flow of an entirely invisible and intangible fact, all visible and tangible matters are changed and distorted or rendered normal. The code of conduct depends upon establishing the fact of yourself. You have to go behind what you feel and behind what you think and behind what you hope for or even aspire to and find what you are. If, like the Chinese philosopher, you can accomplish this, you will discover that you are an inevitable fact and must inevitably accomplish certain things, must inevitably pass through certain experiences, and must inevitably be yourself forever. The realization arising from this discovery solves in itself the thousands of secondary issues that depend upon a fundamental realization. In the last analysis, it is not that you should do what you think you should do, or that you should not do what you think you should not do, or that you should desperately overcome this, or frantically develop that, but rather realize that you are what you are, not apparently but factually, and that all the struggles which you impose upon yourself are a wrestling with shadows. You approach realization. There is no use trying to be free. There is no such thing as freedom. There is no use trying to sustain around yourself arbitrary standards and codes. These, like freedom, have no existence. It is impossible to escape fact, and it is impossible to make any unreality permanent. From a certain inward strength arising from the open-eyed acceptance of truth, you can build outward, tolerantly, majestically, transcendentally, not by rising above things, but by rising to things, realizing that the fact itself is the ultimate of height as well as the finality of endeavor. The inhibitions of society become more or less non-existent. The laws of others inconsequential, in fact too worthless, to break as well as to keep. The fact within being supreme, it is not necessary to conquer the universe step by step, or to rebel against inhibitions one by one. Such striving, according to the Taoist, is very exhausting. Rather, by first destroying the illusions at their source, conduct ceases to be a problem. It is no longer necessary to say, "What shall I do?" or "What shall I not do?" The truth remains that I do what I am. Nothing else is reasonable or possible. The only crucial matter is the original finding of the real. If by misfortune and the lack of discrimination, appetite or emotion is accepted as the real, there is failure at the beginning. Only the true and absolute fact, which is the source of all, can be the working premise. Once this is achieved, there is no problem left in life. And for lack of this achievement, there is no solution to the problem of life. Therefore, the commandment, find the real. And with this, there is no need of other commandments, for the fact itself is vaster than all law, deeper than all understanding, and incapable of separation into ideas or preachments. It takes many laws to keep a foolish man on the path of purpose, but the wise man needs no laws at all. He is law. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can please consider donating to Wars of the Roses, links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.